Good evening from London. I want to welcome everyone to LSE's online events platform. My name is Peter Trubowitz. I'm a professor in the International Relations Department and director of the U.S. Center at LSE, which is hosting today's lecture and discussion about American democracy. Today's discussion is part of the U.S. Center's Fallon Family Lecture Series, which is made possible by the generosity of the John and Amy Fallon Foundation. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Professor Robert Lieberman of Johns Hopkins University and Professor Suzanne Mettler of Cornell University. Rob is the Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins. He has written extensively about American and comparative politics, including award-winning books on race and public policy. Former provost at Johns Hopkins and the co-convener of the American Democracy Collaborative, he has received fellowships from the Russell Sage Foundation, the American Philosophical Society, and the German Marshall Fund. This year, he is the John G. Winant Visiting Professor of Government at Oxford. While he joins us from Baltimore soon, he hopes to be in Oxford as the visiting professor of government there. Suzanne Mettler is the John L. Senior Professor of American Institutions in the Government Department at Cornell. She's the author of 6 books on American institutions and politics. She has won numerous book awards and prizes, and her essays and op-eds are featured in the New York Times, among other leading outlets. Member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the recipient of Guggenheim and Radcliffe Fellowships, Suzanne serves on the board of the Scholar Strategy Network, the American Academy of American and Political and Social Sciences, and is another driving force behind the American Democracy Collaborative that she, Rob, and others convene. So when I approached Rob and Suzanne last October to talk about their new book, 4 Threats, The Recurring Crises of American Democracy, I thought there was a very good chance that former President Trump would not accept the November result. What I had not figured on is that we would be meeting here on day 2 of Trump's second impeachment trial. But here we are, and we could not be in better hands for helping us make sense of the current moment in American politics by putting it in some historical perspective. A few words about the format today before we get underway. Rob and Suzanne are going to get us started with about 25 minutes of opening comments or remarks. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up to discussion. And we've left really plenty of time for questions. So, please don't be shy. What you can do is just send your questions to us via the Q&A function on Zoom. And I'll do my level best to get as many of them in as possible to Rob and Suzanne during the discussion period. Now, normally at this point, I would ask all of you to put your hands together to give our speakers one of those very warm LSE welcomes. That's not possible, of course, today. So in lieu of applause, I really encourage you to pose questions in the Q&A period for Rob and Suzanne. Rob and Suzanne, welcome to LSE's online platform. It's really great to have you with us. The platform is yours.
All right, well, hello everyone, and thank you so much, Peter, and thank you for welcoming us to LSE. Of course, we only wish we were all together in London. I'm here in upstate New York with several inches of snow on the ground, but surprisingly, the sun is shining, so this is a rare moment. So, it was just over 1 month ago that we were watching in horror as hundreds of Trump supporters stormed the US Capitol, trying to interfere with the final step in confirming the results of the 2020 presidential election. They desecrated the sanctuary of American democracy with the Confederate flags and Nazi symbols by trying to overturn the will of the voters with brute force. 6 people died, many police officers were badly wounded, and of course, it could have been much worse. Most shocking of all, the insurrection was incited by the president himself, who had spent the past few months denying his loss in the election, despite all evidence to the contrary. To their credit, members of Congress reconvened that evening and ultimately confirmed the election results. But 139 members of the House Republican caucus, the majority of them, plus several Republican senators, refused to recognize the election results from some states. Rob and I sent our book, Four Threats, off to press last spring. And over the next 9 months leading up to the election and in the months since, damage to American democracy escalated. And so many events that occurred reminded us of occurrences in the American past that we had written about in our book at other times when democracy was also in danger. And the January 6th insurrection took us back to the late 19th century. In those decades following the Civil War, democracy, for those who had the right to participate, was quite vibrant. By then, it included African-American men in the South who had gained voting rights and were participating at high rates in elections, even after the demise of Reconstruction. And many were running for office, primarily as Republicans. Also, the People's Party emerged in 1892 out of the agrarian populist movement, and it too began to run candidates quite successfully. But at that very juncture, democracy was thrown into crisis. I want to zoom into North Carolina in the 1890s. There, Republicans and populists noticed that if they would join forces running candidates on what they called a fusionist ballot, they stood a chance of beating Democrats. At that time in the South, that was the party run by white elites. So that's what they did. In 1896, the fusionists managed to elect Republicans as governor and to the majority of North Carolina's seats in the US House of Representatives and their state assembly. So Democrats' worst fears had come to pass, and they plotted their way back to power. In 1898, they staged a coup d'etat in the city of Wilmington. It was the state's largest urban area and a success story. African Americans were moving into the middle class. 3 members of the Board of Aldermen were Black, as were numerous public sector employees. The Daily Record was a Black-owned newspaper, and as a daily, it was the only one of its kind in the nation. Democracy seemed to be on the rise. On the morning of November 10th, nearly 2,000 white men who belonged to paramilitary groups gathered at the city armory. They marched to the offices of the Daily Record, set the building on fire, and watched it burn. Then they advanced through Black neighborhoods and murdered hundreds of residents. They dragged prominent people from their homes and took them to the train station and made them leave town. Before the day was out, the coup leaders then, at gunpoint, forced the resignations of the mayor and aldermen and installed their own in their place. On January 6, 2021, the similarities were all too striking. Just like in 1898, armed white supremacists were once again the most visible in the insurrection. But in both instances, it was political party leaders who incited the violence and spread the misinformation. And what occurred in both events was that these party leaders were unwilling to abide by the most fundamental principle of democracy, that when elections are held, someone will lose. And when you as a candidate or your party loses, you have to accept the outcome, stand down, concede, and communicate that to your supporters that they must do the same. So stepping back, the overarching question for the book that Rob and I have written is whether we should also be worried today that the United States democracy is genuinely in peril and will continue to be. Now, some would say that despite everything that has ensued in these past few years, that democracy has prevailed and it's safe. And many think that the United States is protected by having an old constitution, the oldest in the world, complete with a system of checks and balances intended to fragment power. The United States is also wealthy, which is a factor that makes the loss of democracy more unlikely. In addition, while the nation in the 1790s included institutions that repudiated democracy, most of all slavery, it did not become a full democracy until the 1960s and 1970s. But still, it's fair to say that democracy has progressed over time, particularly in recent decades, becoming more robust and inclusive. On the other hand, there are reasons to be concerned and to remain so. US democracy can be considered at risk of deteriorating or backsliding. As we've learned from those who study democratic deterioration in other nations, these days we don't tend to see democracy taken at the barrel of a gun or canceled elections or the disbanding of the legislature. Rather, it tends to happen in more subtle ways. Typically, elections are still held, and yet democracy decays, such that a nation becomes a hybrid with some democratic features, but not others. It becomes a variant of what's called competitive authoritarianism. So in other words, we shouldn't be thinking of an on-off switch for democracy or not democracy, but rather a continuum. And the question is whether the nation is moving toward full democracy or backsliding in the direction of autocracy. So that's the task we take on in this book. We examined 5 earlier periods in American history when people were concerned about backsliding. We observed the patterns that ensued, and then we analyze the contemporary period in light of what we've learned. Now, by democracy, what we mean is a system of representative government with accountability to citizens. And there are 4 pillars that make this work. The first is free and fair elections and abiding by the outcome of the elections. The second is the rule of law. Third, the legitimacy of the opposition. And fourth, the integrity of rights, meaning civil liberties, civil rights, and voting rights. These features give us indicators that we can assess in the 5 historical periods that we study in order to assess whether democracy is advancing or retreating. Now, we've learned from those who study democracy around the world that 4 key threats make it vulnerable. And the first of these is political polarization. Democracy works well when there are multiple groups and identities in a society and people have overlapping, or what we political scientists call cross-cutting affiliations. What that means is that you associate with people who have different views than you, whether in your place of worship, your workplace, civic organizations, etc. What's problematic is when all of these differences increasingly align and people sort themselves into 2 camps of us versus them. Then politics ceases to be a process involving negotiation and accommodation. Rather, it becomes like mortal combat and opponents seem like enemies. The second threat is what we call conflict over the boundaries of the political community. Democracy works well when people agree on who is a member and what their status is. If there's an unresolved formative rift from the nation's founding over who is included, that can reemerge as a source of trouble again and again, whether it's over race, ethnicity, gender, etc. In the periods we examine, battles over race take center stage over and over again, especially concerning those most overtly excluded in the United States founding, African Americans. The third threat is rising economic inequality. Places where inequality is high and growing are more likely to suffer democratic deterioration. Why? The reason is that the affluent become worried that the masses will impose redistributive policies and higher taxes on them. So to protect their interests, they seek to solidify their power, and they're willing to support repressive measures to do so, if that's what it takes. Finally, the fourth threat is executive aggrandizement. This refers to the enlargement and concentration of powers of the nation's top leader, and in the United States, this means the president. And this leads to the demise of checks and balances in a way that can make a nation more prone to tyranny. So all 4 of these threats, Rob and I find, have waxed and waned over the course of American history, and they've combined in different ways at different times. But what we've learned is that American democracy has been fragile. It's been in crisis time and again. One threat alone, political polarization, created havoc in the 1790s, right out of the gate, right after the nation's founding. In the 1850s, the confluence of 3 threats precipitated the Civil War, and these same 3 threats combined again in the 1890s. So I want to return to that era now, picking up where I left off at the beginning. A few months after the coup in Wilmington that I described, the North Carolina Democratic Party leaders took measures to make their power permanent statewide, they scaled back voting rights by establishing poll taxes and literacy tests. As one Democrat who was a state senator put it, he favored, quote, a good, square, honest law that will always give us a good Democratic majority, end quote. What happened in North Carolina brought out into the open a major transformation that was occurring more quietly all over the South during the 1890s as white elites shut down the political opposition. The federal government, including Republican presidents, permitted this. In 1898, President McKinley heard the pleas of African Americans in Wilmington asking for help, but failed to intervene. As disenfranchisement happened in state after state, President Theodore Roosevelt simply watched. Then President Taft went so far as to praise the restrictive rules for excluding from the electorate what he called an ignorant, irresponsible element. By the end of the decade, all four pillars of democracy had suffered harm. The main result was the disenfranchisement of millions of Black men and some poor whites. And once Blacks lost political power, their civil liberties and civil rights were taken away as well. Jim Crow was established and it lasted 60 years. So this was major backsliding in the United States. And white Southern elites regained extra political power, not only to rule in their own states as autocrats, but also to exercise an outsized voice in national politics for the next half century. So now I'll turn things over to Rob.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks to Peter and LSE for hosting us. So I'm going to pick up the story essentially where Suzanne left off. As Suzanne just recounted, the 19th century saw the convergence of three threats: polarization, conflict over membership, the resurgence of white supremacy, and the rise of economic inequality. That resulted first in the Civil War in the middle of the century, and then, as Suzanne just described, in mass disenfranchisement in the late 19th century. The story of American politics in the 20th century is largely a story of the rise of the fourth threat that Suzanne described a few minutes ago, executive power, and mostly in a context where the other three threats were receding. So our story about executive power, this is a story that goes back really to the very early 20th century, but our story begins in the 1930s with the Great Depression and the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. FDR took power in 1933 at a moment of deep economic and political crisis. It was the trough of the Depression. Democratic regimes in Europe were beginning to decay into various forms of authoritarianism, fascism in particular. And many Americans expected FDR to assume a similar kind of dictatorial power. Many liberals, many supporters of Roosevelt urged him to do so. For example, the liberal newspaper columnist Walter Lippmann. And to make a long, complicated story somewhat short, Roosevelt did not, in the end, assume what we would consider today to be dictatorial power, but he did oversee the dramatic expansion of the powers of the presidency considerably. Not because he seized power, but because Congress gave it to him. Much of this is well known. The policy authority of the presidency grew, the size of the administrative state, the bureaucracy that the president oversees expanded. The president was given new White House staff. Some of the things that Roosevelt tried to do to gain greater control of the government failed. Court packing, for example, in 1937. Less well known is something that Roosevelt did in 1940, just as the United States was on the cusp of entering World War II, where Britain was already in the war. The United States was not yet in the war, and Roosevelt was consumed with anxiety at that time about worries about Nazi and to a lesser extent communist subversion in the United States. Roosevelt signed a secret memo, which was actually authored by J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI, the internal security force in the United States. Roosevelt signed a secret memo authorizing illegal wiretapping in response to these fears of subversion, primarily targeted at foreign nationals, but also at US citizens. It gave Hoover and the intelligence services a fair bit of leeway to deploy the power of the government under presidential order against not just foreign nationals in the United States, but American citizens. The bottom line about the 1930s is that democracy persisted in that it didn't devolve into authoritarianism. The United States did not become a fascist regime the way many in Europe did, but it did so without challenging the systemic and foundational racial inequality that underlay American politics coming out of the 1890s, as Suzanne described. And it survived with a new set of tools of executive power across the board that only grew in the ensuing decades, with the establishment of the national security state during and after World War II, that led to an increasing focus on domestic surveillance, and on executive power as a portfolio of tools that were available not only to help the president manage policy, manage the economy, and oversee the government, but also a set of tools that were available for political interference by an ambitious president, which is what we see very briefly in the 1970s when Richard Nixon becomes president. Nixon really weaponized the tools of the presidency, was the first president to do that. This is most well known in the story of Watergate, which we narrate in the book. Watergate is really just the sort of tip of a very large iceberg of executive weaponization, in which Nixon systematically used the power of the executive apparatus to target his political opponents, his enemies. We could go on at great length about this, but I won't, although happy to talk about it in the Q&A. Ultimately, and this is a touch point for thinking about today, ultimately Nixon was brought down by a bipartisan coalition in Congress. Enough Republicans eventually supported his removal that he resigned before he could be impeached, and by the constitutionally faithful behavior of other actors in the system, the Department of Justice, which investigated, judges, who enforced the law, the press, and so on and so forth. In the 1970s, what we saw was the growth of executive power, while the other threats were relatively low. Polarization, conflict over race, and economic inequality were at a relatively low ebb. Executive aggrandizement by itself was enough to destabilize democracy, but democracy again persisted. These historical episodes, which we've really touched on only briefly here, there are others in the book, and we're happy to expand on these in the Q&A. These episodes reveal, as Suzanne indicated, that American democracy has been much more fragile, much more frequently than we often think. These crises recur. For those of us who grew up and came of age in the second half of the 20th century, we need to remember that this was a time of unusually stable and calm stability for American democracy. Over and again, if we look more broadly and deeper into the past, over and again, the country has risked instability and violence and the diminution of rights. In short, the possibility of what political scientists call democratic backsliding. The four threats have waxed and waned, have come and gone, have combined and recombined throughout history in a number of different ways, leading up to today, back to today. And when we say today, we don't just mean, sort of now-ish, we mean actually today, as Peter indicated in his intro. We're competing with the trial of the president in the United States Senate. So we're grateful to those of you who have given up watching that and are spending some time with us. We're at a moment of an extremely dangerous convergence. For the first time ever in American history, we face the convergence of all four of these threats at once. And this means we think that democracy is genuinely at risk. A lot of this story is familiar, and we won't belabor it here. Polarization is at an extremely high level today. The sense of not just conflict and disagreement between the parties, but a real sort of us and them relationship between the two sides in politics. The sense in which opponents are not just political antagonists, but enemies. Now, we should point out that this is not really symmetrical. It's not that both parties have moved away from the center. One party, I think, has really seriously gone off the rails and is behaving in many ways like an anti-democratic, anti-system party that's willing to go to any lengths to win elections, regardless of the consequences for the democratic system. It may not go too far to say, as our colleague Daniel Ziblatt of Harvard has said, that the Republican Party may be the most serious threat to American democracy today. That's one threat. Conflict over membership, particularly over race and immigration, has grown and has increasingly fused with partisanship. That is, the parties are divided over questions about race and systemic racism and racial justice and immigration in a way that hasn't happened in a long time. Third, we hardly need to describe rising economic inequality. And finally, the executive aggrandizement, the growth of presidential power that I just described has continued to grow through the Bush and Obama, excuse me, and Trump administrations. This rise, this combination of threats predated Donald Trump. We regard Trump as a symptom rather than a cause, but he's actively intensified them. The examples of that are too numerous to mention. He didn't cause these things, as I said, but he's benefited from this unhappy convergence, and he's had an unerring instinct to make things worse at just about every turn. And as Suzanne indicated, the attributes of democracy, these pillars of democracy, have really suffered damage under these conditions over the last 4 years. The conduct of elections, free and fair elections, continued voter suppression, the rule of law. Think about Trump's ability to flout the emoluments clause of the Constitution and make money off the presidency, essentially. The idea of a legitimate opposition, the idea that you and I can disagree without being enemies. And as Suzanne indicated at the top, the consequences of that damage, I think, were on full display just about a month ago, as a resentful and violent, almost all white mob, many flying Confederate flags and other white supremacist symbols, under the incitement of the presidency of the United States, attacked the Capitol. The president who spread deliberate falsehoods about the 2020 election and telegraphed to his most ardent supporters his contempt for democracy, which the political scientist Adam Jaworski defines. This is Jaworski's definition of democracy, is a system in which parties lose elections. Now that he's gone and his actions are under some careful scrutiny in the Senate, we're breathing a sigh of relief just like everybody else, I think. But we do worry that our sigh of relief might be premature, because all of these conditions that produced the Trump era of the last 4 years still exist. Let me just close by suggesting that we don't think that these conditions necessarily determine what happens in a mechanistic sense. That we're not, doomed to slide into authoritarianism. What conditions do is they enable leaders and citizens to make choices. And our American democracy, and I think democracy around the world today, faces a hard problem, and that is our diagnosis doesn't necessarily give us a clear roadmap forward. We need to understand better what kinds of reforms might improve the commitment to democracy. But what we ultimately think is that it's that commitment to democracy that needs to be front and center. Americans still believe in democratic values across lines of party and ideology and religion and so on and so forth. The question that I think Americans and supporters of democracy everywhere need to face is how to make preserving and restoring democracy itself a top political priority And I think that's as good a place as any to leave off. And we really welcome your questions and the discussion.
Wow, that's great. Suzanne and Rob, that was a terrific synopsis of your book. It's already generating a lot of questions in the chat. I think I see about 18 there right now. Before we turn to these questions, the first thing is I want to just welcome. We have people from literally across the globe with us, folks from Libya. I want to welcome you from the US, from Turkey, Ivory Coast, Greece, Nigeria, Malaysia, Australia, the Czech Republic, Bangladesh, Canada, Sri Lanka. The list just keeps going on. So welcome everybody. I think I want maybe exercise the chair's prerogative and ask maybe the first question, because you make a very compelling argument in the book about the pathways to the current crisis. But I want to ask you a little bit more, maybe push you a little bit more where Rob ended up at the end on maybe if we could call it like the remedy, or the path forward out of this, because you've sketched, I mean, it's not a trifecta, it's a quadfecta. I mean, this is like a perfect storm. All four of these causal mechanisms, I suppose we could describe them, have shown up at the same time to create this perfect storm. And what you said, Rob, towards the end was that American voters are, that they're concerned about democracy, and that they're alarmed about authoritarianism. And I want to play devil's advocate here. I have a lot of sympathy for that position. But as you know, there's mounting evidence by people like Larry Bartels at Vanderbilt and others who are suggesting that there's a growing number of voters, especially, but not only, but especially in the Republican Party, who are essentially willing to trade off. I mean, Bartels doesn't put it this way, but I'm putting it this way: trade off democracy for policies that protect their advantages, and that this is I guess I'm wondering, what's your response to that? I mean, is that accurate? And if it's accurate, how does one cut into that? I mean, is the solution changing, the mechanisms of voting in the United States, given the polarization, to go to proportional representation? Is it, that the US should move to some kind of multi-party system? Could you kind of just talk to that side of it, given the picture, the kind of dire picture, or that you've painted, and and it's easy to agree with it. What's the way out? How do we dig ourselves out, and what does the past tell us about how you get out?
Well, maybe I'll start out here. It's a really hard question. So for one thing, these four threats, once they're set in motion and intensifying, they take on a life of their own. And there are not simple solutions to rein them back in. And, really, the more you study the dynamics of polarization, for example, the more you see how that works. So, I had long thought, what would it take to rein things back in? I thought maybe a major national crisis would bring people together. Well, then we had the pandemic, and it actually, has heightened polarization. The way people respond to it in the United States about, whether you're willing to wear a mask or not, just plays into polarization. So, reining in the threats is not an easy solution. And then, you know, people will often say, well, why don't we just get rid of the Electoral College, or, you know, change some of these structural features of the United States that are so problematic and that really have, you know, always limited democracy. But doing those things, that's not easy either, because we don't have the political will to do that right now. So what I think is that the best way forward is trying to strengthen what we call the pillars of democracy. Free and fair elections, the rule of law, the legitimacy of the opposition, and the integrity of rights. By trying to, you know, Democrats generally today support these. The problem is that the Republican Party has increasingly become an anti-system party, a party that is putting winning above and, you know, dominating above the practices of democracy. But there are members of the Democratic Party, and there are, you know, rank and file people as well as some elected officials who do still want to support these major pillars of democracy. So I think that the best thing now can be trying to shore those things up together. So, for example, there is, you know, an effort to try to strengthen voting rights, and I think that would be a great goal to pursue at this point.
Rob, do you want to add anything, or?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it is the really hard question. So thanks, Peter, for leading off with that one.
I wanted to get my question in.
No, and I think it's the right question to ask. I mean, I think one of the challenges, as Suzanne said, is that, you know, even though most Americans of both parties support democratic values, the parties are not at the party level. The parties are not equally committed to democracy right now. So I think Suzanne is absolutely right that we need to focus on shoring up the idea of free and fair elections and the rule of law and these pillars, these attributes of a healthy democracy, which are things that we should be able to agree on. The dilemma is that one party, the Democrats, are committed to these things, you know, vocally and visibly, and the Republicans are at best divided over whether or not these things are valuable, at least through the Republicans in public office, Republicans in Congress and in state legislatures. So, you know, a month ago, we were all celebrating the heroism of sort of low-level, state-level election officials who protected the integrity of the election from this onslaught by the president. But now we're seeing similarly state legislatures introducing voting restriction reforms. And so the Republican Party at best is divided over these questions. And at worst, as Suzanne said, has become an anti-democracy, anti-system party. So, you know, as much as we might want to say that we agree on these things, we're relying on one party at the moment, the Democrats, to carry the water. And that puts us in a difficult position.
Yeah, although as you allude to the fact that there's tensions in the Republican Party, and where you ended up in your argument, there's a presumption that there are Republicans that would be responsive. And this brings me to a cluster of questions. So there's already 33 questions in the question box here. And one group of them has to do with, I guess we could call this the Whig question. So Helen Jones asked, do you think this is the end of the Republican Party as we knew it? Will it split? Can it recover? Archie Clark, a different take on the question on this issue. Do you believe the Republican Party will continue to follow the path that Donald Trump has set out, or will they attempt to reshape the party and move away from Trump for the 2024 election? And just to kind of maybe complicate it, there's a series of questions here also about what Joe Biden should do, and should he be reaching out, making efforts to reach out to the more moderate, if you will, moderate conservative Republicans. Um, it's not clear from this whether it's to sow greater division in the Republican Party or to somehow rebuild a lost center, to deal with the problem of polarization. But I thought maybe we start here with this question about the Republican Party. We also have a cluster of questions that I want to come to next about putting the US in comparative context. But let's start with the Republican Party.
All right, I'll start out. Yeah, I think that the death of the Republican Party is greatly overstated. There were a few moments, I think, in the very last days of Trump's presidency when, Mitch McConnell kind of made noises that he was open to conviction, perhaps, that people were talking about that. But I think that was very short-lived. In fact, the Republican Party has shown itself to be a very strongly unified party, despite its strange bedfellows, despite the fact that, since the 1980s, it has brought together social conservatives and fiscal conservatives. And increasingly, it has transitioned to becoming a party that has this, very socially conservative base, and a base that is at the least not committed to strengthening civil rights, and then more ardently comfortable with white supremacy. And so I think that, in a sense, Trump picked up on something, on a potential in the Republican Party that had been there for a while, and other political leaders had not been willing to go there. So John McCain, Mitt Romney, they were not willing to cater to those kinds of inclinations of the party, to nativism and white supremacy. And Trump had no problem doing that. And it helped him to win the election in 2016. And as much as there are continuing tensions in the party, I think that the different components of the party know that they need each other. There's a core of the Republican Party, which is very committed to serving the most affluent Americans and business. They got what they wanted from the Trump administration. They got major tax cuts and deregulation, and they are willing to put up with the other aspects of the party, the other components, because that's how they win elections. So I think we're not going to see the party move away from Trump, even if Trump fades into the background. This really began before Trump with the Tea Party, and of course it has much older roots. We could go way back, but I think we're going to continue to see the Republican Party looking more like that as it moves forward. But I'll leave the rest for you, Rob.
Just to add to that a little bit, I think it's important to remember that the next national election in the United States is not the 2024 presidential election, but the 2022 midterm congressional elections. In almost always, the president's party loses seats in congressional midterm elections. So it's very, very likely that the Republicans will gain seats in one or both houses of Congress in the next midterm. So the Fifth Senate right now is split 50-50, which gives the Democrats control because Vice President Harris is the tiebreaker. And their majority in the House of Representatives is very small. So we're looking at the very strong likelihood that in years 3 and 4 of the Biden presidency, he'll be facing one, if not both houses of Congress controlled by Republicans. So this is sort of adds fuel to the argument Suzanne was making, that there's no reason to expect the Republican Party to go away or to change its behavior. And that brings me to to the question about Biden. I think one of the things that we seem to see Biden doing right now is learning from the experiences of the Obama presidency. In the first couple of years of the Obama presidency, the Democrats again had unified control of Congress for a short time, with larger margins, in fact. And even then, Obama's approach was to try and be a unifier, try and be a compromiser, try and reach out to Republicans. And Republicans absolutely put up a wall of obstruction. Didn't go along with anything, not a single vote for the Affordable Care Act or for the stimulus that the Obama administration passed in its first year in the financial crisis. And I think Biden is showing much more willingness to go it alone, to figure out a way to do things without the participation of the Republicans, without Republican votes, to use these arcane budget procedures in Congress to do things without Republicans. This is a risky game for Biden. On the one hand, it'll be good for him and the Democrats if the government can do things that help people and begin to restore some faith in government. On the other hand, it doesn't do anything to assuage the sort of us versus them polarization that's taken hold.
Well, I could continue with that line of, those are great answers. I'm going to switch though, because we've got a bunch of questions. Probably it doesn't surprise you. We're here at the LSE. We're in the UK, and we've got some questions that about the US, putting the US in comparative context. And one of these comes from, I think I have this right, the Right Honorable Baroness Stewart. Isn't the lesson that democracy is fragile everywhere? But a somewhat different spin on it is from Sam Bradley, where he asks, are the 4 pillars of democracy specific to America, or can they be used as a model to aid the introduction of democracy elsewhere and elsewhere in the world? Like when you presumably, I mean, you both have comparative sensibilities and perspectives, and have done comparative research. When doing this project, you've thought presumably a lot about that, and so I'm wondering if you can speak to that, say a few words about that.
Yeah, I can start with that one. The comparative sensibility and thinking comparatively about the United States is really how we started off writing this book. It began really after the 2016 election, when we, like many of our colleagues who study American politics, were sort of gobsmacked by what had happened. And we began to talk to colleagues who study other parts of the world, who study the rise and fall of democracy elsewhere in the world. And they would say things like, what the first questioner said, oh yeah, democracies come and go. We had a good run in the United States. Or they would say, yeah, this reminds me of what happened in, and then they'd reel off some list of horror story countries where democratic governments had slid into some kind of authoritarianism: Turkey, Hungary, Venezuela, and so on and so forth. And so our analysis of the things that threaten democracy, the 4 threats of the title of the book, comes directly out of our thinking about the comparative setting. That is, what is it that we know from the study of democracy around the world is particularly threatening to democracy. Democracy is fragile everywhere, of course, but what I think that we were trying to respond to was a sense among people, both Americans and people who study American politics, this sort of sense that American democracy was somehow invulnerable, that American democracy was solid, and that, yes, perhaps at the beginning we weren't a complete democracy, many people were excluded over time, but that there's a sense among Americans that the story of American democracy is one of progressive improvement over time. and that we've been striving toward this ideal and toward this goal, and that we're getting closer, ever closer and closer and closer. And that's just not true. It's just not true about the United States. And so I think what's particularly revealing when we set the United States in this comparative context is how we can see the same kind of ebb and flow, the same kind of back and forth, up and down, that we see elsewhere. And to people outside the United States, the idea that the United States is subject to the same forces as everyone else might not be a revelation. But we thought it was an important way of thinking about the United States, of helping Americans think about the United States.
And in the US, it is a revelation. So, yeah. Suzanne, do you want to say something, respond to this, or should I put, we only have about 8 minutes. So I'm happy to take this or move to another topic.
Yeah, you could, I think Rob has covered it. You could move to another topic.
So look, I've got a slew of questions. It's not going to surprise you at all. That has to do with the role of technology and its connection to polarization in the United States. And I think Ben Grozda of LSE Conflict Studies has kind of captured it succinctly. Do we have any chance of reducing polarization while Facebook's business model exists in its current form by profiting off of polarization? But there's a series here about Twitter and, also, Fox versus MSNBC. And given that your book goes back in time, I mean, people often don't realize that the press was incredibly partisan in the 19th century. And so maybe talk a little bit about that and technology and polarization and how different or similar the current crisis is to past ones on this dimension.
Yeah, I'll start out here. Neither of us is an expert on technology and social media, et cetera. But, as a non-expert, I would say, certainly it seems to exacerbate polarization. But I think we make a mistake if we assume that contemporary polarization comes from social media or particular kinds of technology today. And yeah, Peter, as you were saying, frankly, it was when the United States was right out of the gate in the 1790s that polarization grew very quickly in that first decade under the new Constitution. So journalism was being used then. Newspapers were being used as a vehicle as mouthpieces of the emergent political parties and their party leaders for communicating to the public. And they worked very well to do that. And it was, not only political leaders, but also ordinary citizens who became very polarized very quickly, really saw themselves as two different camps. And then we see that happening, in periods in the 19th century as well. And again, newspapers playing a major role here. So I think, there's something more fundamental going on, a more fundamental political dynamic that's going on. And the technology is a medium for it, but not the cause. It may help to exacerbate it and spread it more quickly. It may be leading to more nationalization of politics in the United States more quickly today, but it's not the cause. And our contemporary polarization has really been growing for decades.
Rob, should I go ahead and move on?
Yeah, you can move on. That was a perfect answer.
Right. So we've got 5 minutes left here. There's an interesting question that has come in here from Jonathan Anketel, which focuses on the role of civic education and whether and how it might help restore democratic norms. and I think that the way that he frames the question is he wonders the extent to which the American education system, in a sense, is partly to blame for the kind of the situation today, maybe in that it reproduces inequality. I wonder if we could get you to speak to the role of civic education. Is there a role in trying to deal with the polarization and the nature of the crisis in American democracy today?
I think, um, uh, first of all, I'd say I probably know even less about civic education and its impact on politics than I do about the media. So we're entering a zone of speculation here. But I think to the extent that we think that the remedy to this involves, a commitment to democracy and democratic values and democratic procedures, it stands to reason that to the extent that people have a better understanding and appreciation of how democracy works, of how our institutions are structured, of the sort of slightly messy, sometimes Byzantine way that American politics works. I think that kind of appreciation can only help. I mean, I think there's a big disconnect between people's expectations and the way things actually happen. So I don't know, Suzanne, if you have anything to add to that, but I think there's something to that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I mean, both Rob and I teach big classes of Intro to American Politics, and I feel like that kind of education is so essential for people understanding how complicated the political process is. And so I think that's important. And I think, for appreciating the basic, these pillars of democracy that we've been talking about, I think that Americans tend to take them for granted or really not think about the seriousness of them. And I think that that's essential. I think it would also be great to have education that helps people to be critical about news so that they're not so vulnerable to conspiracy theories. And so on. But at the same time, I don't want to overstate, again, that's not a silver bullet. Civic education is not a silver bullet. And I think there are a lot of people with plenty of education who have gone along with a lot of the danger to democracy that we've seen in recent years. So I think, we need to be cautious about that.
I think, that's probably a great place to leave it. We are at the bewitching hour, and that's both kind of optimistic but realistic. And I want to, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to Rob and Suzanne today. Plenty of food for thought here. Rob and Suzanne, on behalf of the U.S. Center and the LSE, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts about the future of American democracy. It's really been great to have you on the platform. Thanks so much.